Today, we are discussing a rule issued by the United States Department of Justice that is designed to limit how foreign countries may be able to access certain types of U.S. personal data.
This rule really is broad. Did they mean it to be as broad as it seems to have been written? Yes, this is intended to be as broad as you feared that it might be. So the definitions of sensitive personal data really are broad. They are taking this seriously and devoting resources to it and trying to recruit people in the private sector to whistleblow on organizations where they identify a violation.
One of the exemptions for the data security program is for clinical investigations that relate to the FDA. There are a lot of ambiguities in how it's going to be applied, but part of the understanding that comes through in the preamble of the DSP is that DOJ is going to have a lot of deference to the FDA to figure out what kinds of transactions are going to fall within that exemption or not.